Winter of 1942. If you were a merchant sailor on the run to North Russia and you fell overboard into the Barents Sea, you didn't have a survival time of hours. You didn't even have 30 minutes. You had exactly 2. In 2 minutes, the 28-degree salt water would trigger a massive cold shock, causing your lungs to gasp uncontrollably. In 60 seconds, your muscles would seize, rendering your limbs as useless as lead weights. Within 2 to 3 minutes, you would lose the ability to swim or keep yourself afloat. But death, true death from cardiac arrest, often took longer. Unconsciousness could come in as little as 5 to 15 minutes, with the final outcome determined by the sea's merciless calculus. In reality, most sailors who went overboard in those waters didn't survive long enough to find out. During the height of World War II, the United States and Great Britain sent over 4 million tons of supplies to the Soviet Union via the Arctic Circle. To do it, they used a route so lethal that the Germans didn't even need to sink every ship. Sometimes, the ocean did the work for them. By the end of the war, the run to Murmansk and Archangel would claim 104 merchant vessels and over 3,000 sailors. On the infamous Convoy PQ-17, the loss rate wasn't 10% or 20%, it was nearly 70%. Out of 35 merchant ships that set sail, only 11 made it to port. What drove men to sail into such a trap? The Arctic Convoys weren't just a logistics operation, they were a journey into conditions so extreme that many veterans would spend the rest of their lives trying to forget what they'd seen. The year is 1941. Hitler has launched Operation Barbarossa. The Soviet Union is in freefall. Moscow sits within striking distance of German artillery. Stalin's message to Roosevelt and Churchill cuts straight to the bone. Send tanks, planes, and food, or we collapse. And when we collapse, Hitler owns Europe. There were 3 ways to get supplies to Russia. South around Africa through Iran, months at sea. Across the Pacific to Vladivostok, if the Japanese let you. Or north. The Arctic route from Iceland to Murmansk was only 2,000 miles. Fastest route? Worst odds. The passage forced convoys through a 200-mile corridor between polar ice and occupied Norway. In summer, the sun never set, and German patrol planes could track you constantly. In winter, darkness was so complete you couldn't see the ship in front of you. Add gale force winds and sea smoke, fog so thick it became a wall. Waiting in the Norwegian fjords was Germany's fleet in being. The heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper, the Lutzow, and the Tirpitz, a 52,000-ton battleship that was itself an entire naval crisis. Supporting them were roughly 300 Luftwaffe aircraft and U-boat packs hunting along the ice edge. This was not a voyage. It was a gauntlet measured in miles of guns. The Arctic Convoys tell a story about engineering under extremity. What the ships could survive and what they couldn't decided who lived. The American Liberty ship was built for speed of construction, not grace. At Bethlehem Fairfield, workers assembled one, the SS Robert E. Peary, in just 4 days and 15 hours. These vessels were 441 feet long, designed to carry maximum cargo with minimum cost. They could haul 10,000 tons, roughly 440 light tanks, or 2,800 jeeps. Powered by triple expansion steam engines, they made 11 knots. A surfaced U-boat could outsprint them. Liberty ships were welded rather than riveted. Below minus 40 degrees, this mattered. Steel becomes brittle in extreme cold. A torpedo hit to a riveted ship created a hole. A torpedo hit to a brittle welded hull could fracture the entire frame. Some vessels literally split like timber. This vulnerability was more pronounced in 1942, when the Arctic was still a learning ground for Allied logistics. The sailor's nightmare came from the sky more often than the sea. The Junkers U-88 was versatile. The Germans built it for bombing, reconnaissance, fighting, whatever the moment required. It could carry 2 2,000-pound torpedoes, or 3,000 pounds of ordnance. Using a tactic known as the Golden Comb, dozens of aircraft flew low in a line and dropped simultaneously. It was a wall of fire your slow convoy couldn't outmaneuver. Defending these floating warehouses were small 200-foot warships built on whaling ship hulls. The Flower-class corvettes were the thinnest shield imaginable. Based on a commercial whale ship frame, economical, not military, they struggled in 40-foot Arctic swells that made them feel less like ships and more like corks. Crews experienced near-constant nausea, drenched and freezing for months. Armed with a single 4-inch gun and depth-charge throwers, they were heavily outgunned. But they were all the merchantmen had between themselves and the ocean's killers. Daily life on the run north was a war of attrition against nature itself. Sea spray froze solid within minutes. By morning, a ship could carry 200 tons of ice buildup on its superstructure. This top weight made vessels unstable. Capsizing meant death in roughly 120 seconds. Sailors worked 4-hour shifts in screaming wind, swinging hammers and axes at frozen iron just to keep the ship from turning belly up. Then came the psychological toll, often called Arctic madness. The summer months offered 24-hour daylight. Men couldn't sleep. They stood watch for days straight, scanning the horizon for the black speck of an approaching U-88. Exhaustion created phantom threats. Sailors reported seeing U-boat periscopes in every wave, bombers in every cloud. In thick sea smoke, silence was absolute, broken only by the terrifying sound of a ship's hull groaning as it contracted in the cold. A sound many compared to a giant's teeth grinding together. Some men had to be physically restrained from jumping overboard just to end the waiting. One sailor aboard the SS Daniel Morgan remembered the worst part was silence. You're eating soup in the galley. The general quarters alarm tears through the ship. You run topside. The man you were sitting with 3 minutes ago is gone. His ship has been hit amidships. No scream, no splash, just a column of fire. Then the ocean fills the silence where the ship was. The physical damage was relentless. Metal railings, deck hardware, even the hull became hazards. Touch bare metal with exposed skin and you'd lose flesh instantly. Veterans described the smell constantly. Diesel fumes, human sweat soaked into wool, and beneath everything, the sharp chemical scent of subarctic air. In June 1942, Convoy PQ-17 reached the breaking point. 35 merchant ships assembled, carrying $700 million in cargo, nearly 300 aircraft, 600 tanks, 4,000 trucks. The escort was powerful. On paper, the convoy had teeth. But intelligence reported that the battleship Tirpitz was preparing to sortie. Fearing catastrophe, Admiral Dudley Pound ordered 3 words transmitted at 21:11 on July 4, 1942. Convoy is to scatter. The warships withdrew west, hunting for a threat that never materialized. The merchant ships, slow, lightly armed, carrying ammunition and aviation fuel, were told to disperse and reach Russian ports independently. They were abandoned. Over 7 consecutive days in waters where daylight never fully faded, the Luftwaffe and U-boats hunted them one by one. The SS Christopher Newport took a torpedo from a Heinkel bomber and sank. The SS William Hooper was caught by a U-boat and finished in minutes. Some crews tried hiding in fog banks or between ice floes. The Germans found them anyway. One American ship, the SS Daniel Morgan, fought for 2 days. Armed with .50 caliber machine guns mounted on a cargo vessel, her crew repelled repeated U-88 attacks and shot down 2 bombers. They watched 4 ships around them detonate and vanish. Eventually, U-88 ran them down. As the ship went under, the U-boat captain surfaced, refrained from firing on the lifeboats, and gestured toward the nearest coastline. A brief moment of grim acknowledgement between enemies who shared the same merciless sea. When the remnants reached Archangel, 11 ships had made it. 24 were gone. The losses included 210 aircraft and 430 tanks, desperately needed by the Soviet Union. Soviet officials accused the surviving crews of cowardice. For men who had crossed a gauntlet of fire, the insult cut deeper than the Arctic wind. Between 1941 and 1945, the Arctic Convoys delivered 7,000 aircraft, 5,000 tanks, and the food supplies to sustain a 10 million-man army. But in 1942, 1 ton of cargo was lost for every 3 delivered. If you crewed a merchant ship on the Murmansk run, statistics gave you a 1 in 20 chance of not returning. If your ship took a torpedo hit, survival odds were nearly 0. The Royal Navy lost 16 warships in Arctic waters. Merchant Marine casualty rates reached 5%, higher than the U.S. Marine Corps in the Pacific. These were civilian sailors in what became a military graveyard. The Germans held tactical advantages. Aircraft operated from nearby bases, U-boats positioned along ice boundaries. A $20,000 torpedo could destroy a multi-million-dollar cargo ship. Those 4,000 Studebaker trucks became the backbone of Soviet mobility. Aviation fuel allowed Soviet fighters to outclimb German aircraft. Every successful crossing reshaped the Eastern Front. Yet veterans insist the primary enemy was the ocean. Katabatic winds created whiteouts. Sea smoke disabled radar and concealed submarines. Ice accumulated faster than crews could remove it. 40-foot waves rose like cliffs. One British officer said it plainly. They spent 10% of their time fighting Germans and 90% fighting the Barents Sea itself. These were civilians, dock workers, engineers, teenagers on their first ship. No armor, no speed, no escape. Arctic veterans spoke of the Murmansk stare, the look of a man who had watched the horizon for 10 days, knowing death could arrive at any moment. Murmansk itself offered no safety, bombed daily, watched by the NKVD. Crews waited weeks before turning south and running the gauntlet again. Despite PQ-17, the convoys continued. They were rebranded. Escort carriers joined the runs, merchant hulls with flight decks welded on top. On PQ-18, they shot down 40 German aircraft. The balance began to shift. By May 1945, the Arctic convoys had won their war. The tanks fought at Kursk and beyond. The trucks carried the Red Army into Berlin. The fuel and supplies that crossed those waters became the foundation of Soviet victory. For decades, these sailors were forgotten. The Cold War made their sacrifice politically inconvenient. Only in 2013 did Britain issue the Arctic Star Medal, 70 years later. Many of the men who earned it were already gone. Today, the Barents Sea is quiet, but beneath it lies the largest underwater graveyard of World War II. Hundreds of tanks, thousands of aircraft, and over 3,000 sailors preserved in freezing darkness. For 4 years, that narrow Arctic corridor was the most critical stretch of ocean on Earth. Every tank, every crate of ammunition, every gallon of fuel had to pass through it. The final question was simple. You have 120 seconds in that water before the cold takes you. Will you step onto that ship? They did. Again and again, they did. If you want more stories about the forgotten fronts, the brutal decisions, and the men history almost erased, subscribe and sail with me into the parts of the war most people never see.